Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Beastie Boys and Babylon Noise. This is my study of the book of Revelation in little 10-minute increments. And by the way, speaking of 10-minute increments, I keep wanting to go long, and that's because I'm packing so much review in. So I'm going to start trusting that you have been watching this. If not, then it's going to be confusing anyway. So I'm not going to be reviewing other than maybe just what we did the last week, just to make sure that we're, catching up where we left off. So speaking of that, we are taking a little pause this week to do a little pit stop, and you'll understand why, I think, as we move along. So, if you remember the last couple of weeks, we've been in the heavenly throne room. We've begun the second of the big vision cycles where John is taken up into heaven and sees this amazing throne room worship in progress. And then last week, we got to chapter 5, where, as I say, the plot kind of kicks in, where the God has a scroll in God's hand, and no one is worthy to open it, to enact God's will on earth until the lamb comes. And everyone thought it was going to be a lion, then it was a lamb. We talked about mascots. Hopefully that's all familiar. I wanted to pause this week and come back to this issue of empire, because I think really, in order for us to get a good handle on the drama that John is elaborating on here, and to help us really understand how it relates to the authoritarian government we're facing in our own time, it's really going to be important for us to understand how ancient Jews understood sin and empire. So I'm going to start by saying this. I'm willing to bet if I asked you to name sins, you would probably name individual bad behaviors, things like lying, cheating, stealing, murder, things like that, right? Individual behaviors that people undertake. I think it would probably take most of us a little bit of time before we got to more systemic stuff. And that's interesting because in the ancient world, it probably would have been the opposite. They certainly had laws against the individual things. I mean, you think of the Ten Commandments and stuff like that, right? But because they were the scriptures came to us from collectivist cultures, they thought much more systematically about sin. Sin was rarely ever only my responsibility. It was something that we shared together, and particularly in scripture, when we start to talk about the wrath of God against sin, which is something that comes out big in the book of Revelation, this really becomes important. So let's do a little brief history of where the Bible comes from, right? The books that we have collected into the Bible, particularly when we're talking about the Hebrew Bible, or what Christians call the Old Testament, really were put together in the wake of a massive cultural apocalypse that scholars call the exile. What we're referring to when we talk about the exile was the conquest of the kingdom of Judah by the empire of Babylon. So if you zoom out a little bit, you have that in the ancient Near East, there were these two very small, very unimportant countries called Israel and Judah. Israel was a little bit to the north. Judah was more in the south. It's where Jerusalem is today, by the Dead Sea and all that. Israel's where like Nazareth and the Sea of Galilee and all that kind of stuff is, right? In 722 BCE, Israel was conquered by the Assyrian Empire. And again, the only reason anyone cared about either of these two nations was basically because they were on the Mediterranean Sea. And so they had access to water and to shipping and all of those things that cultures today still fight wars over, right? So 722 BCE, the kingdom of Israel falls, and a bunch of refugees swarm down into Judah, and they bring with them all of their stories, right? All of their heroes, all of their religious stuff. That all kind of gets mixed in with the Judahites, and then about 150 years later, in 586 BCE, the kingdom of Babylon conquers and destroys the kingdom of Judah. Now, we don't have time to get in all the nitty gritty. What's important here to recognize is that it was a cultural apocalypse. The way Babylon conquered was by completely decimating the cultural infrastructure of the nations that they conquered, so that they could not rebuild and gather around and rebel again. And so the Israelites and the Judahites had to figure out a way. Well, they didn't have to, right? They really wanted to figure out a way for their cultures to survive. The vast majority of human cultures that have ever existed have been lost to time. We don't know much about their gods. The only way we know anything about their religion is if we happen to uncover some archaeological artifacts. And Israel and Judah are unique in that their cultures not only survive but continue to shape the modern world in the form of Christianity and Judaism, and arguably even Islam, because that goes back to Abraham. And so what we see in the Bible is this concentrated, concerted effort by Judah-ish and Israelite scholars to work together to create the sense of national identity out of defeat, right? Rather than writing a triumphalist story and saying, hey, we're the best because we win everything, they said, hey, we're the best because God chose us as a single people, and God actually let us be destroyed. So they're having to theologize why God allowed them not just to be defeated but destroyed, right? And the way they justify this is that they were unfaithful to the covenant that God had made with their ancestors, and so God allowed these other empires to come in and destroy them. And you see this a lot throughout the prophetic literature and a lot of the songs and the psalms. And there's a particular phrase that gets used a lot, and it's the wine cup of the wrath of God. The image here is that God fills a wine cup with wine and then basically pours it out and forces these conquered nations to drink it, and they're almost like drowning in wine because God is pouring it out. And this is a metaphor for empires coming and conquering them. So again, this is a conquest this is a metaphor that we see a lot throughout the scriptures. You see it in Jeremiah 25 verses 15 and following. It's in Psalm 60. It's in Psalm 75. It's in Isaiah 51 verses 17 through 22. It's in Obadiah verse 16. Now this was a common metaphor that got used a lot, and the people understood when someone talked about God forcing people to drink his wine to the dregs or something like that, right? That this was a way of talking about God allowing empires to come in and conquer people who had been unfaithful. Okay, now got to remember that wine cup metaphor because it's going to come back. And I think I'll have one other thing that'll help you make it stick. If you think about Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, he is about to be crucified by Rome, who is the empire of its day. And spoiler alert, in the book of Revelation, Rome gets referred to as Babylon. It's the latter day evil empire, right? And when Jesus knows that he's going to the cross, knows that he is going to be executed in a particular way reserved for traitors to the Roman Empire, right? This very particular way of singling out an enemy of the empire. He specifically prays that God would let this cup pass from him. He's employing that cup of wrath metaphor even in the Garden of Gethsemane. That's how he's processing his own fear and anxiety about going to the cross. And then, of course, he says, but not my will, your will. And then, of course, we know he does go to the cross and he does drink the wine cup of God's wrath to its dregs. So, what does all of this mean? Well, it means when we're talking about sin, particularly in Revelation, but really throughout the Bible, we are focusing not merely on individual bad behavior, probably not even mainly on bad behavior. We are focusing on people who are caught up in systems uh, of evil, systems of sin, systems that make it difficult for us even to choose righteousness, even if we wanted to, because we are trapped in these systems that oppress us. We see that all over the place today, and we're going to talk about it a lot as we again kind of explore what it looks like to resist authoritarianism. So just very briefly, because I didn't want to ignore this, even though we're on this little detour, we need to look at systems of empire, systems of authoritarian government as the rotten fruit of sin. These are what sin looks like when it's most fully itself. Okay, it's not that you said a cuss or something like that, right? Though again, whatever, don't say cusses, I guess. Uh, we need to be much more concerned with these kind of systemic evils like ICE, right? Like these horrible immigration policies, like everything that's going on in Gaza right now. We need to look at these as the fruit of sin that we need to take seriously. We do need to treat sin as both individual and systemic. There's no reason to say, oh, I guess we can individually do whatever we want as long as we're not caught up in genocide, right? It's better to say, as we look at our own individual behavior, how might we also be supporting genocide? That's what a lot of these protests at universities have been about, right? Trying to get people to divest and universities to divest, right? That's doing that. And what we're going to see in Revelation specifically is John focusing on systems more than individual behaviors. We heard some of the individual stuff in the seven letters, but we're going to hear a lot more of that. And how that ties to the systems, and how the systems are actually making it difficult for the churches to choose righteousness, and how that's actually the call of faithfulness, is to choose righteousness even when, and maybe especially when, the system is against us. So I hope this was helpful. I imagine it was a very different way for you to think about sin. I know it has been for me on this journey as well. But next week, we're going to dive back into the story of the Lamb and the scroll. And we're going to see Jesus start to pop the scrolls off of God's announcement, God's will, so that it can be read and enacted. And as he does, and as he pops off scrolls in heaven, all hell's going to break loose on earth. And we're going to start with the four horsemen next week. So let me know what you thought of this idea of sin as a systemic issue in the comments. I'd love to kind of work that out in a space where we have a little more time together. Until next week, take care of yourselves, take care of one another, and grace and peace be with you.